Okay, is everyone seeing this okay?
Yes.
Not you guys. Okay, I think so. All right, great. So I'm very excited that you're all here today to hear about my thesis project. As Leland mentioned, my master's thesis has to do, since we're all vaccinated, or at least all you guys are wearing a mask, and I'm fully vaccinated as of today, I'm actually not going to be wearing my mask. All right. So I'm very excited to share with you my project, which has to do with white-tailed deer foraging habits in Great Plains grasslands near wooded and agricultural habitats. So to get an idea as to what I'm going to be discussing today, here's a bit of an outline. First, I'm going to be talking about the Great Plains and edge effects. Then I'm going to be discussing white-tailed deer in Kansas, followed by my observational methods and results, and then my experimental methods and results, then a discussion on my findings, and lastly, management implications and future directions for the project. So let's go ahead and set the mood, if you will. Oh, which reminds me, I apologize. Lighting. Yeah, now I can see the pictures. There we go. All right, sorry. Back again. Okay. So my study, as I mentioned, takes place in the Great Plains. It's a very vast landscape that actually goes from Canada all the way down to Mexico. Here in the U.S., you can see the extent here in this map on the U.S. It's a very large area. And within the Great Plains, there are many types of ecosystems. Some which we may be more familiar with are the prairie ecosystems. So just to give you an idea, historically, approximately 40% of the U.S. was covered by prairies, or about 170 million acres. And that is a lot of land. That has changed post-European settlement. And just to give you an idea as to how much that has changed, if we focus on Kansas, for no particular reason, of course, especially in eastern Kansas, here you can see the original extent of the tallgrass prairie in light green. It was a very vast area, but through many changes, because this land is very fertile and very conducive to agriculture, a lot of it has been converted for agricultural purposes, as well as diminishing or almost non-existent fire management techniques. A lot of this area has experienced woody encroachment into these grasslands, causing extremely highly fragmented landscapes, resulting in today approximately 4% of the original tallgrass prairie left, which you can see here in dark green. So that's a very small area. These, as I mentioned, these fragments are these areas are extremely highly fragmented. And I do want to point out that here in eastern Kansas, the large dark green area coincides with the Flint Hills. And the only reason that's largely remained intact is because it's not conducive to agriculture, because the land is too hard, or it's not very easy to till. So for the most part, it's remained large and intact, but it's still somewhat fragmented. Now, the reason fragmented landscapes are an issue are because of something known as edge effects. And before I really get into what an edge effect is, I'd like to define edges first. So a habitat edge then is this ecological boundary or transition zone between two adjacent landscape patches or land cover types. So here in this image, you can see a very obvious prairie edge next to an agricultural edge. And this one is very abrupt, it's very sudden. Not all edge habitats are this abrupt. There are some more transitional ones. For example, if we look at this image, the red upland vegetation and the blue pickleweed marsh have this area in between, or this ecotone, that is shown in purple. So the upland vegetation and the pickleweed marsh each have their own characteristics, abiotic factors, so they support very specific types of flora and fauna. The ecotone then is very interesting because it's kind of a mix of these two landscapes, and it can support both species of adjacent habitats, but it also creates this unique habitat for its own species that it can support. So you can hopefully see some of these purple species also residing within these ecotones. So within these ecotones, then we tend to see a lot of edge effects. So edges can modify a broad range of ecological parameters, including abiotic properties, species behaviors, and species interactions. A greater proportion of small fragments are affected by edges, and I'll explain a little bit more about that here shortly. There are some species that live within edges because they can benefit from both adjacent habitat types. Edge effects have been extensively studied in ecology, but even so, there's still a bit of an enigma because there's so many factors that contribute to edge effects that it's really hard to really figure out the direction. And by that, we mean if it's going to be a positive, negative kind of edge effect, the spatial scale, or where exactly they're occurring, especially from distances away from the edge, and the magnitude, or just the differences in percent of edge effects, if you will, how large an edge effect will occur depending on the species. So they're very difficult to predict. But there have been a few hypotheses stated that kind of have helped ecologists attempt to predict how edge effects are going to occur and predict essentially what's going to happen given a certain species and certain circumstances. So one of these hypotheses then was proposed by Rees and Sisk in 2004, where they suggested that the edge type was an important factor in explaining variation in edge effects. And in 2017, then Rees et al. Made what's known as the edge response model, which is what they're using to try and predict how a specific organism is going to react to edges. So here, let's go ahead and begin by looking at the top panel. So depending on the habitat type and the type of resource that it offers to an organism, if the resource is supplementary, meaning that both habitats offer the same type of resource, for example, both habitats offer nutrition to an organism, and as you can see here in this first rectangle, if the habitat types are of equal quality, then you really don't see much of an edge effect where you don't see differences in the abundances of the organism. On the other hand, if you have a supplementary resource and the habitats are of unequal quality, you expect a negative abundance of the species close to the edge that has a higher quality compared to the habitat that has lower quality. There's going to be a larger edge effect or a larger abundance of whatever species you're looking at. So that's for supplementary resources. For a complementary resource then, depending on the habitat quality, we see different effects. So a complementary resource then is a resource that is a different resource that is offered by both habitats. So for example, one habitat provides nutrition and the other habitat provides a form of shelter from any type of biotic or abiotic threats. So if the habitats are of equal quality, you expect to see a positive effect or a positive abundance of these species near the edge because they want to utilize both resources. In contrast, if you have then habitat types that are of unequal quality, you expect to see a much larger drop off into the habitat that is lower quality compared to the one that is higher quality. Okay, so this is especially important. I'm mentioning habitat types and resources because, especially in much of Kansas, as you can see from this aerial photo, there's a lot of fragmentation occurring. A lot of it, as I mentioned, comes from agricultural conversion of the land, as well as these riparian zones or these woody areas around bodies of water where these trees are starting to expand and they kind of intersect the landscape. So fragmentation then becomes an issue because as a habitat gets smaller, the edge effect then becomes greater. And what I mean by that is if we look here at this image, you can see in the image on the left, the largest habitat patch, approximately 30.55% of that habitat patch is influenced by edges. But as you get smaller and smaller habitat fragments, then much more of the habitat is closer to these edges, thus increasing the percent influence of habitat edges on the landscape. Now, if you think about and take that a step further, in the smallest habitat fragment, you can see that there's areas where there's very little core habitat or in the interior of the habitat left. This then also plays into the idea of double edges. So if we focus on the area in the upper right in green, this section of this grassland that is completely surrounded by wooded habitat is very close to both the northern and eastern wooded edges. Potentially then both edges are affecting this landscape, producing what's known as a double edge effect. And there have been some studies done on double edges. A review in 2013 by Perinsky and Young of 11 studies showed that 10 of those 11 studies found that a second nearby edge had additive effects on the species they were studying. So it was important to consider more than one edge. One of these papers was written by Fletcher in 2005, where he was looking at the occurrence of male bobolinks, which you can see here, they're very pretty. And he wanted to see if they were selecting for nesting, how they were selecting for nesting habitat within a grassland. So I really want you to focus on this part of the graph. There's distance from the first edge and from the second edge. And on the y-axis, we have the probability of occurrence of these bobolinks. So you can see bobolinks were specifically selecting habitat that was furthest away, not just from one edge, but from the other edge as well. They wanted to be as far away from any edge, as close to the interior habitat, as close to the core habitat as possible. There are species then, unlike bobolinks, that do prefer living in the edge because, as I mentioned, they will benefit from both habitat types. Some of the more characteristic species around here that inhabit edges are white-tailed deer, blue jays, and the ever-lovable trash panda. Now, while all three of these species likely affect their habitat in their own way, I'm really going to focus on the potential edge effects that white-tailed deer mediate into these grasslands. And you might be asking yourself, why are you focusing on deer? Well, the answer is actually very simple. Historically, white-tailed deer were fairly uncommon in the Great Plains, and they were only associated with riparian zones. In fact, in the early 1900s, deer became extirpated from the state to where deer had to be brought in from outside, and then through conservation efforts, the deer population became stable enough that in 1965, the first modern hunting season was implemented. So if we compare numbers harvested, in 1965, approximately 1,153 deer were collected. In 2017, almost 80,000 deer were collected. And that is a huge amount of deer available for hunting in an area where they used to be considered uncommon. And it was actually estimated that in 2019 that the deer population is approximately 620,000. That is a lot of deer going into areas where they were previously rare. So what exactly then is allowing these deer to encroach upon this habitat in such high abundances? There's a few different ideas for that. One is that there's a high number of deer in the eastern US. That's where the highest population numbers occur. And animals need space, so it's likely that they're migrating westward, because if they go east, they'll probably hit the Atlantic Ocean, and I don't think they like it there. I mean, they might, but there's really nowhere else to go besides west. So really, there's just a large amount of deer that need space, so they're moving westward. Second, there are no large carnivores really to help regulate the deer population. Most of these large carnivores have been extirpated or just no longer reside within the state. Lastly, if you guys remember earlier, I showed you a fragmentation image. Deer are associated with these wooded habitat edges. And as you can see here, if a deer wanted to travel from east to west or west to east on this map, they could very easily do so by following this corridor of trees. They just need to stay within it, and they can go just about anywhere they want. Now, this then brings them close to grassland habitat, exposes them to this area where there aren't any other large herbivores for them to compete with. Why is this an issue with more deer in these grasslands? There have been plenty of studies done to see which species deer are consuming. And I really want you to focus on this part here in the red square. This study used exclosures or if you will, cages where they basically surrounded an area to not allow deer to browse species within them. And the researchers noted in 2001 that areas that were protected or areas that had these exclosures, there was a much higher abundance of these species compared to areas that were unprotected or areas that allowed deer. So they were consuming these species at very high rates. As I mentioned, there have been a lot of studies as to what deer eat, and the deer have also been shown to prefer leguminous species or species that fix nitrogen. A study done in 2015 by Nisi et al. Focused on 5 specific legumes to determine which species mammalian herbivores were preferring. Now, these 2 species in the middle, Dahlia candida and Dahlia purpurea, I'm not going to focus on because they were hypothesized to mostly be consumed by rodents. But the other 3 I will talk about. So first, let me go ahead and explain the graph. This is an electivity index. A positive value indicates that the species is being selected more than would occur at random. And the negative value is indicating that the species is being avoided more than would occur at random. So if we first look at, for example, Desmodium canadense, we can see it has a very large positive value, indicating that deer were specifically consuming this plant. Now, if we compare that to Amorphokinescens and Lespedeza capitata, both of them have very large negative values, indicating that deer were essentially avoiding these species. They weren't interested in consuming them. So deer are are consuming forbs, and they're also specifically consuming legumes, but actually deer aren't really consuming grasses. And the evidence we have for that is that in 2001, Anderson did a study on a tall grass prairie, where I'm going to focus where these 2 red boxes are. They also used exclosures to either allow or deter deer in these areas. And if you notice in the exclosed areas versus the unexclosed, or the ones that allowed deer, the percentages of these species are very similar. So if we just take, for example, the first one, Sporobulus heterolopus, there's a difference of from 47 to 54%. That's a very small difference. If you go down the scale, you can see that most of these are not very different from each other. This suggests then that even though deer have access to grasses, they're not really consuming them. And as a matter of fact, Anderson et al. Noted that there was only 2 species of grasses that deer really consumed, panicum and Andropogon giardii. And even these that they were consuming were only consumed at a rate of 0.2 and 0.4%. So deer aren't really consuming these grasses, but they are consuming the other species in grasslands, allowing for the possibility for a large change in biodiversity and a change for these grasslands to become dominant in these areas and really reduce the amount of forbs and legumes. Another reason that it's important for us to focus on what deer are doing specifically in grasslands is simply because there's a gap in knowledge. The majority of studies that have been done on edge effects occur in forested ecosystems, almost 3 times as much as they have in either open habitats or woodland savannas, which is what we have around here. So we don't really know what deer are doing in these grasslands. We know what they're doing in forested areas, specifically because there are a large amount of deer there. So it makes sense that most of the studies on deer focus in these areas. But we don't really know if they're directly translatable from a forested ecosystem to a grassland ecosystem. So it's very important for us to try and figure out what's happening. And as you may guess, that's exactly what I tried doing. So I had 4 research questions that I specifically focused on. First, I wanted to know if the habitat edge influences deer browsing intensity in grasslands and how far into these grasslands does this edge effect extend. Second, does the type of habitat, specifically woodland and agricultural areas, because these are readily available and very easy to find, and they're the most common within the area I surveyed, if these habitat types affect the intensity of deer browsing, are they behaving similarly in grasslands adjacent to either type of these habitats? Third, I wanted to know if there was a consistent preference for hierarchy for forbs and or woody plants. We saw that deer consuming certain species but avoiding others, and we wanted to find if there was some sort of pattern we can discern from this. Lastly, my last question was to understand if the proximity of a second closest edge affected the intensity of deer herbivory. So in these areas where there's more than one woody edge nearby, are deer browsing more heavily or less heavily within these grasslands? So for the first 3 questions, I really used observational methods to collect my data. And from that observational data, I was able to come up with an experiment that specifically addresses the 4th question. So what is it that I was doing out of these places? Here is a map of my study sites. They were all focused within the Wellington-McPherson lowlands, simply because it's the same physiogeographic region, and we wanted to make sure that sites were directly translatable to one another. You can see that there's a large gap here in western Kansas where I didn't have any sites, and that's because that's essentially where the Flint Hills begin, and we weren't sure that land use would be the same or that plant species would really translate between these 2 different regions. So I had 4 survey rounds that I conducted. Within each survey round, I tried to use 10 sites, 5 that were bordered by wooded habitats, which you can see in blue, and 5 that were bordered by agricultural habitats, which you can see in green. Now I know that there's 14 sites up here, and that's simply because in one sampling round or another, I lost a site, so I had to replace them when possible. So that's why you see 14 and not necessarily 10. So what was I doing out in these grasslands? Let's go ahead and take a look. Here is an example of a wooded edge next to a prairie, and you can see that the prairie is extending away from this wooded edge. So within one of my sites, I established 3 transects. Each of these 3 transects were 20 meters apart. Within each transect, then, I had 6 different distances away from the edge. At each one of these distances, I implemented 2 surveys per distance for a total of 36 surveys per site. All in all, given COVID being what it was and how much time I actually had, I implemented about 1,200 surveys overall over 2 years. I'm glad I did the math because I did not expect to be doing that many. Anyway, so within these survey points, I was looking for, sorry, let me back up. I mentioned that I broke up my surveys into 4 rounds. Each round was split into June to July, or what we're referring to as early summer, and August to October, or what we refer to as late summer, for both 2019 and in 2020. And the reason we did the seasonal split between my surveying was because of the seasonal plant phenology. Different plants are flowering in different time periods, and they're available essentially for browse and at different heights within different periods throughout the growing season. So we wanted to make sure that we accounted for that. Once I found a plant that had the very characteristic torn deer browse appearance, I used the 1 meter quadrat placed over this, what I call the focal point, the one that I found with browse, and surveyed the community immediately surrounding it. And the reason I did this then was to determine species preference, because I was able to account for which species were available for deer to consume and which ones they were actually consuming. And then, in 2020 only, I implemented point distance sampling, where at each distance from the edge, I wanted to see if there was different browsing intensity by deer. So after all that data collection, I did my analyses in R. I used generalized linear mixed effect models to measure the responsive revivery using fixed variables such as season, edge distance, edge type, life form, and species, and random variables, site, transect, and survey plot. I then also used 2 key post hoc comparisons to determine significant differences between levels of categorical variables. For example, if there was a significant difference between 2 species or between 2 edge distances. Now, I don't know about you guys, but when I do stuff in R, I kind of feel like this. Although I had to tailor this a little bit more to be specific to WSU. So after playing in R and from a lot of help from a lot of friends, let's go ahead and see what it is that I actually found out. So my first question then had to do specifically with edge distances, if you recall. So in 2019, I found a significant effect of distance to edge in early and late summer. I also found a significant difference between early season edge distances, but not in late season edge distances, meaning that deer, here's this graph showing essentially what I'm trying to say. Is in 2019, then I have my early and late season shown in green and brown. On the x-axis, we have distance from the edge, and on the y-axis, we have proportion browse. So as you can see in the top panel in the green, in the early season, deer were browsing very close to the edge, and they were browsing very minimally up to 100 meters away from the edge. But in the late season, there's really no significant differences between these distances, meaning that deer were equally likely to browse at all distances up to 100 meters away from an edge. So in 2020 then, stop me if this sounds a little bit familiar, there was a significant interaction between distance to edge and season. There were significant differences between early season edge distances, but not late season edge distances. Again, deer were more likely to browse near the edge in the growing season. And this is what this looks like. So again, on the x-axis, we have edge distance. On the y, we actually have a slightly different type of proportion, because for 2020, if you remember, I implemented a point distance sampling to determine intensity, and this is the data that I used for that. So it's a slightly different y-axis, but it's still a proportion of browse. In the early season shown in green, you can see that deer were much more likely to stay close to the edge when browsing, but they still were browsing some up to 100 meters away. In the late season, there's really no differences between the intensity of deer browse at all these distances up to 100 meters away from an edge. So why is this seasonality occurring? Why are we seeing these patterns? There's a few different reasons why we might be seeing this. First, there's a predation hypothesis, which has to do with the fawning season, where fawns are mostly born between May and June. That's when it peaks. So young fawns are very vulnerable to a lot of threats from both predators and abiotic factors such as heat and a whole bunch of other things. So it's likely safer for does and deer to stay near the edge and browse nearby where they have cover. As fawns get older throughout the growing season, they become less vulnerable. So this may be why, as the growing season progresses, deer are more likely to browse farther away from the, from the edge. There's also the potential that they're actually depleting their resources. Because in early summer, they're really focusing around the edge. It's possible that they're consuming a lot of plants within the area, so they reduce the availability, and they just have to travel further away from the edge to find more sources of nutrition. And lastly, 100 meters may not actually be far by any means for a highly mobile species like deer. I did see a slight drop off after 100 meters, but if you notice, deer browsing never really reached zero. So there may be a second drop off potentially further away from edge distances, but my sites were not large enough to really detect this. So let's go ahead and look at my second question, which had to do specifically with edge type. So edge type was actually not a predictor for browsing in early 2019. There was a marginally significant two-way interaction between edge type and edge distance in late 2019, as you can see here. So again, on the X, we have edge distance, on the Y is proportion of stems browsed. In gold, we have agricultural habitats, and in blue, we have wooded habitats. So if we focus first on the agricultural habitats, we can see that deer were pretty equally likely to browse up to 40 meters away from the edge, and much less likely from 60 to 100 meters. In contrast then, in grasslands that were next to wooded habitats, deer were fairly equally likely to browse up to 100 meters away from the edge with no clear discernible pattern. So what does this look like in 2020? If you recall, I did mention there was a significant interaction of edge distance, which actually plays into a significant three-way interaction I found between season, edge type, and edge distance. This graph is specifically showing edge type with season, the interaction between the two. And again, early season is in green, late season is in brown. We can see that in the early season, deer are almost 3 times as likely to browse near wooded edges compared to agricultural edges. But then as the growing season progresses into late summer, deer are fairly equally likely to browse at both of these habitat types. In grasslands adjacent to both of these habitat types. So in order to understand what was driving this three-way interaction, I further partitioned my data by season to see what was occurring in each season. What I actually found then was that there was significant interaction between edge type and distance in early 2020, but not in late summer 2020. Then to further explore that interaction, I further partitioned my data by edge type to see what was occurring at each edge. So on the X, we have, again, edge distance. On the Y is my point data sampling with proportions of stems browsed that were available at a certain distance. So as we can see here in agriculture shown in gold, deer were fairly equally likely to browse up to 40 meters away, and it decreased somewhat after that. And then next to wooded habitats, deer were much more likely to browse near the edge, but there was a weak negative effect of distance away from the edge next to wooded habitats. So then why is this occurring? Why are we seeing these patterns? Well, if you kind of recall back a little bit to, I know it was forever ago that I talked about the edge resource model, but it's possible that wooded edges are providing complementary resources. I didn't necessarily measure the quality of the habitat or see how deer were affecting or how deer were interacting with the habitat adjacent to my grasslands. But if we look at the complementary resource graphs on the bottom, I do see a lot of these patterns where there is a spike at very close to the edge, and then it kind of drops off. It's possible that I wasn't seeing as strong effects next to agricultural habitats because the type of crop available where I surveyed are not necessarily palatable to deer, so they're not really consuming it, and it's not really useful because they can't really use it to hide or to do much of anything else. There's also the possibility that woody species are extending further into grasslands, which essentially can create these little islands or refuges far away from the edge, so that deer still have that protection even if they're not closest to the wooded edge. So then moving on to my third question, excuse me a second. My third question specifically had to do with deer preferences among what I'm referring to as life forms. So in early 2019 in the top graph, life form is what I'm using to refer to the different types of plants, either forms, legumes, or woody species. In 2019, I specifically surveyed for the closest woody species within a 10-meter radius of my survey area, and recorded whether there was browse on the species or not. As you can see, deer were preferentially consuming woody species, followed by legumes, followed by forbs. Now in late 2019 and both seasons of 2020, I wasn't specifically recording a woody species unless I found browsing damage on them. So I didn't want to overestimate the abundance of the preference for it. But you can still see that legumes were preferred over forbs. And after conducting post hoc comparisons, deer were still more likely to prefer woody species over legumes over forbs in all 4 seasons. So let's go ahead and look at the woody species themselves and see which ones they were consuming and what was happening. There were no significant differences between the woody species, meaning that they were equally likely to select any of the woody species that were present within a grassland. Now here I'm showing you just the absolute frequency of species that I found, and then coming up with a percentage of how many of those were browsed. And what I really like to point out is that in both 2019 and 2020, we see 4 of the exact same species that are being browsed by deer. Excuse me. So moving on then to forbs and legumes, again, I'm just showing the absolute frequency. There were significant differences between forbs and legumes in terms of which species were preferred and which ones were being avoided. But in the same way, there were three forbs or legumes that were present in both 2019 and 2020 that deer were preferentially consuming. These are my top 5 most browsed species. And I really want to point out that it's interesting that deer are actually selecting the same species from year to year, because I didn't necessarily use the exact same sites. So I was still finding this consistency between preferences. So which plants were deer actually consuming then? If we look here at this table, I've split it up into forbs and legumes. These are all the species that I found with browse on them. So to kind of orient you to what's going on, if you focus on the middle part of this table where it says flowering period, I split up when these species are flowering to coincide with my early and late sampling. So my early season sampling coincides with between May and July flowering plants, and then my late season sampling coincides with August to September or late flowering plants. So to give you an idea as to what's going on, let's go ahead and take Ambrosia xylostachya, the first species on here. If you see an X under that month, that means that is when that species is in flower. And then if you look then all the way to the right, I have, it says browsing season, and it's split into 2019 and 2020. If there is a colored box under early 2019, that means that I found that species with browsing damage in that season. So again, taking Ambrosia xylostachya, we can see that I found it with browsing damage, both when it was in flower and also when it was outside of its flowering period, which is very interesting. But for the most part, deer were consuming species when they were in flower. And this could very easily be because flowers are very obvious and they're just very attractive. And that's how they attract pollinators, and they just unintentionally attract other critters as well. So maybe deer are consuming species in flower just because they're more apparent. But as I mentioned with Ambrosia xylostachya, I did have 9 other species that were browsed outside of their flowering period. Why are deer consuming these then? It's possible that these plants are just very tall, so they're very obvious for deer to find. There might be some species that are highly preferred overall. For example, you can see that I have Desmanthus illinoensis here circled. In 3 of my 4 surveys where I found it, they always had browsing damage, even well outside of their flowering period. It's also possible that these species that were browsed outside of flowering period might provide specific or it might be easier to digest the nutrients available to deer from them, depending on usually the carbon-nitrogen ratio that are present within these plants. So let's go ahead and look at some of the species that deer were not consuming, even though I found them well over 100 times in some cases. I encountered these species a large amount of times, but there was never any browsing damage on these species. So here you can see I have it split up into forbs, legumes, and woody species. So it's possible that and it's not likely that deer aren't seeing these species, if you will. All stems that I sampled were at least 15 centimeters in height, which has been shown to be the minimum height for deer to essentially detect or pay attention to a plant. So all of these plants were tall enough for deer to see, but they just weren't consuming them. It's possible that the nutrient content within these plants isn't worth the effort to eat them. Maybe they're not very digestible. Maybe the nutrients that they're offering aren't in very high quantities, so deer are just avoiding them. And I do want to point out that even though I only had 1 woody species that I found with no browsing damage, it's likely that there are other woody species available in grasslands and deer are avoiding them, but I simply wasn't surveying for them, so I didn't detect them. So that was a lot of information, and I used all that information to come up with my top browsing, or my top species browsed by deer, and I came up then with an experiment to test specifically for double edges. So I chose 2 species for my experiment, Illinois bundleflower and Coreopsis tinctoria. And part of the reason we chose these is, 1, because they were highly preferred by deer. If you recall, Illinois bundleflower, Desmanthus illinoensis, was the one I highlighted because they were just eating it whenever they found it, basically. Illinois bundleflower is an early flowering species, whereas Coreopsis tinctoria or Plains Coreopsis is a late flowering species, so it kind of coincided with that seasonality. Additionally, they're from different functional groups. Bundleflower is a leguminous forb, meaning it fixes nitrogen, and Coreopsis is a non-leguminous forb, so it doesn't fix nitrogen. Both species were approximately the same height, so one would not be more detectable than the other to deer, so they were equally likely to see them. And lastly, they have different life histories, which is very interesting. Bundleflowers are perennials, whereas Plains Coreopsis is an annual. So once I picked my 2 species, I had transplants grown in the greenhouse here in WSU from seed that I purchased from a commercial vendor. And I placed seeds within these biodegradable pots. Species were grown separately, meaning each pot had only 1 species to avoid any sort of confounding factors with growing together. Once these species were just about ready to be transplanted, I hardened off my plants at least 2 weeks before planting them, meaning that I took them from the greenhouse, placed them outside to make sure that they were acclimated to ambient temperature so they wouldn't immediately die, at least hopefully, right? So what does this setup actually look like? I had these transplants placed at 3 different sites. I used Chisholm, Pawnee, and Gerber. And at these sites, I had what I refer to as a grid setup, where there was 6 transects with 100 meters, up to 100 meters away from both edges near a wooded corner. Unfortunately, Gerber was not large enough to accommodate a 100 by 100 meter transect, so the largest I could use was 80 by 80 meter. And then within each one of these intersections on the grid, I randomly placed both a coreopsis and a bundleflower to make sure that all species were represented at all distances away from the edge. After transplanting, I surveyed them approximately monthly from July to September. So after a lot of physical work, some of it which removed a black locust removal, which Maris will never forgive me for, but thank you for helping. We have something that looks like this here in the bottom right. And I know it's a little bit hard to see, but hopefully you can see that there's a flag next to this plant, specifically Desmanthus. We dug a hole, made them flush with the ground as much as possible, and then hopefully they survived. Well, so after all this manual labor, what did I find? Unfortunately, 2020 was not a kind summer. If you remember, it was very hot, and there was a lot of other factors that played into this. But here I'm showing the survivorship of my species. So you can see that at Chisholm, the number surviving, I started with 36, decreased, and each one of these black points represents when I actually surveyed them. For the most part, I still had a few Desmanthus left living at Chisholm by my last survey. But if we look at Gerber, my plants lived long enough for me to transplant them, and immediately after they pretty much died, especially the coreopsis. So not super high mortality. Approximately 56 of my plants did survive, and that equates to about 107 plants in total. So out of these 107 plants, 18 of them had browsing damage. And interestingly enough, 2 of these plants actually experienced browsing a second time. But site was really the only important factor when determining if a species would be browsed or not, with Gerber having the highest probability of deer browse occurring, shown by 11 of 18 of my plants being browsed at Gerber. And here I just wanted to show really quick that there was apparently a couple of rodents that decided my pots would make a very good, beautiful entrance to their burrows. So they did not want my plants in their way. And I really do want to point out that we did look at different factors to determine if double edges were affecting species or were affecting the probability of these plants being browsed. But really, location was the only significant factor here. The species themselves wasn't significant. The different distances or the different edge distances, the different edges or the interaction between them was not really conducive to trying to determine what was causing deer to browse these species aside from location. So I know that's a lot of information I've thrown at you, but let's go ahead and go into my discussion and what findings I have. So really, I think one of the most important contributions from my research is that deer show a consistent preference for woody species, followed by legumes, followed by non-leguminous forms. Deer then may actually serve as a minimal woody plant expansion management technique because they're actually consuming a lot of these species that are encroaching in grasslands. Unfortunately, deer aren't necessarily consuming all of them, and a lot of these woody species are clonal, so as long as the underground portion of the plant is intact, they'll likely continue to proliferate, but deer may still be mitigating the rate of woody expansion. Also, flowering period may not be the only reason why deer are consuming certain species. There might be other factors that we should really consider when looking at species preference by deer. Edge effects then are modulated by seasonality. With as you saw, deer were much more likely to browse near the edge in early season, but equally likely to browse at all distances up to 100 meters away from the edge in late season. So this then we saw the strongest effects of edge at about 40 meters away from the edge in all of my surveys. So really the most intense edge effects are occurring up about 40 meters away from the edge. They definitely still have the possibility of altering the plant community by reducing biodiversity, because they are consuming these legumes and then these forbs and avoiding grasses, if you recall. So they definitely have the potential to alter plant species communities, especially with the increased number of deer within the state. Also, I want to point out that the highly fragmented landscapes that I surveyed may actually be low quality, and they might be too small to really determine full effects. And the reason I say they may be low quality is because a study done by Bloodworth et al. In 2020 that occurred at Konza, in a prairie that is maintained regularly by fire regimes and has very little woody expansion occurring within the site, there was little to no deer browsing found, even though there were some woody edges around these areas. Deer were simply just not coming to these well-maintained grasslands. And as I mentioned, I still saw deer browsing up to 100 meters away, meaning that my sites might actually be too small to really determine the full effects of how far into grasslands edge effects mediated by deer actually extend. There was a study by Nisi et al. In 2015 where they were still seeing deer browse up to 450 meters away from an edge. Clearly much, much larger than 100 meters. So it's possible that these fragments then are just low quality and just not very large. But I do want to point out that all of my sites are very representative of most of the prairies in the Willing McPherson lowland. They're all very characteristically smaller. They likely have a lot of woody expansion, and they're just not very high quality. Lastly, nutrient cycling might not actually be as impacted as we previously thought. Deer are consuming legumes, but if there's woody species present, they're likely going to consume the woody species first and not necessarily the legumes. Also, more deer means more poop. They're depositing a lot of nutrients then through fecal matter back into these prairies, so they might not be altering the nutrients as much as previously thought. So what are then some of the management implications of my findings? Plant species conservation then should focus on core prairie habitat. As I mentioned, the highest intensity of deer browsing occurs 40 meters away from the edge. So anything further away than that could potentially be considered core habitat, but the farther away, the better, of course. We could use less sensitive preferred species by deer, kind of as known as a food plot. So if you really wanted to keep deer within a certain area, you can use species that are highly preferable by deer that aren't necessarily of conservation interest to kind of attract them to a specific area and keep them away from something else that may be of higher conservation value. Restoration projects then would really benefit from reduced woody edges. I'm sure that's obvious to many of you, but reduced woody plant expansion into grasslands is of course ideal because woody plants are taking up space. They can potentially outcompete a lot of the forbs and legumes in these areas. But reducing woody plant expansion then reduces this food source for deer, and it also reduces the amount of deer present within an area. Species are less likely to be browsed in prairies that are adjacent to row crop. So if you recall, when I was showing the different habitat types, deer were likely to browse near agricultural habitats up to about 40 meters away and then kind of ignore the rest of it. But next to wooded habitats, they were equally likely to browse at all distances away up to 100 meters for the most part. So if you have a restoration project and you're trying to decide where to implement an area for restoration, maybe next to row crop or agriculture might not be so bad in terms of mitigating deer herbivory. And lastly, I know it's another kind of obvious point, but the restoration area is important for highly mobile species like deer. Deer can travel very far distances. So when we're trying to find a habitat patch or a patch size for restoring ecosystems, or especially prairies, obviously the bigger the better. But it's still important to note that deer are not browsing as intensely up to 100 meters away from the edge. So there may be, if the restoration area is larger than that, there may be hope for whichever plants are being restored. Lastly, then, some future research potentially from my findings. I didn't really look at the spatial relationships of species within sites. So each site might actually show if certain species are occurring in specific abundances away from the edge. Maybe they're congregating around certain areas for whatever reason it might be, and there might be differences within sites then of species present. There is more work needed to be done on double edges. My experiment didn't really produce a lot of information, and we could really use a lot more work on double edges because they're still very important. And by we, of course, I mean Leland. Lastly, exclosure requirements as a function of distance from edge. Essentially, by having different exclosures at different distances away from the edge, we can really determine which species are consuming and how much of an impact they're having then on these communities by looking at the percent of biomass available. So I know I've shared a lot of important information with you. I do have one final piece of very important evidence that I'd like to share with you as to why we should try and figure out what deer are doing. For those of you on Zoom, you might want to turn up your volume just a little bit, but here you go. With that, I would very much like to thank my committee, Dr. Russell, Dr. Luring, Dr. Demisi, for being very wonderful and helping me look at my project through different perspectives. I'd also very much like to thank my field techs for helping keep my spirits up, keeping me company, and especially accompanying me on those very hot days out in the field. I'd like to thank KDWPT, specifically Levi Jaster, Richard Rogers, and Kurt Grimm for providing a lot of resources and information that was very relevant to my project. I'd also like to thank Brad Gurr from the Dick Arboretum for providing landowners for me to collaborate with. I'd also like to thank said landowners for letting me play on their fields and pretend to collect information. I'd also like to thank the two hackermen in my life, Esmond Kayer, for always being a wonderful source of our knowledge, and my very wonderful husband, Lucas Baum, who helps me with those ridiculous R loops that I so much despise. And lastly, I'd like to thank WSU and the Grassland Heritage Foundation for funding the project. Here are my sources, and a few more sources. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions. Ooh, good morning. Okay. Okay. I see that Dr. McDonald has a question.
Yes, Jackie, I'm interested in your seasonality findings. And I'm thinking, about parasites that are dependent upon deer. In particular, I'm thinking about like deer ticks. Would you predict that their distribution would change in the same way that you've seen for the deer?
Yes, definitely. I think so, especially because more deer mean more hosts. I think that they would definitely, they likely would follow those patterns where they're just more prevalent, especially in later season, because deer are just going through a lot more of these prairies, and there's a higher chance for them to encounter them. So I think that we would see somewhat similar patterns for them. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just interested because one can imagine even studies where they might be used as a proxy for the host.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Anyone else? Dexter.
So obviously the Wellington McPherson lowlands are in the central mixed grass prairie, where there's a blend of tall grass and short grass. I'm wondering if you notice a correlation of herbivory on plants that are common within the east, but like in an absence of herbivory on plants that are pretty much exclusive, like west, that are just kind of shoved into the middle here.
Yeah, I'm going to be honest. I don't really know a lot of the species distributions, so I can't say that I would know exactly how to answer that question. But if I were to look at specifically how species are distributed, I do have the comparisons of which species they were consuming versus which ones they weren't. I could come up with some sort of map.
Cool. Yeah, I think that would be kind of cool for like expansion potential and stuff like that.
Yeah, thank you for the suggestion. Dr. Hausman.
Yeah, Jackie, that was a really nice job on that research presentation too. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the potential trade-off with seasonality and distance as it relates to the development of the prairie in terms of above ground biomass over the season. So there's going to be increased biomasses that's above ground as you get further and further into the growing season, how that might relate to both flowering and the distance from the edge.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm trying to rephrase it in my mind because I got lost halfway through, if I'm being honest. Would you mind repeating it?
Well, the main thing here is just thinking about, and you might have said this earlier about how the grassland, as the plants are growing, that particular growing season, it's going to be fairly short. There might be litter from the previous year, depending on burning, but
Right.
then it's going to get taller and taller.
Yeah.
If you get through the growing season, and that's going to potentially provide more increased cover for the animals as they move away from perhaps the safety of the woodland area. So how might that relationship, or how would that factor, that reality, compare or factor in to flowering times and distance from edge?
I mean, as you mentioned, plant available, biomass is going to be higher as the growing season progresses. There's going to be taller plants, and it provides this additional cover for deer. So because there's additional cover, then deer can potentially still be safer farther away from the edge because there's taller grasses, taller plants. In terms of flowering, I imagine that depending on the species, I know they have different adaptations. As the growing season progresses, I mean, flowers might be bigger. I don't know. So there's taller vegetation. They're likely also, if they're in flower, they're attracting more deer to them. They're more apparent. So it could be why, simply because there is taller vegetation, we do see deer moving further away from the edge as well. So
if you go back to your, what species they prefer. So maybe if I'm asking this in a more simple way, just because I've made this overly complicated. Well, kind of what I'm getting at is, if you think, maybe you have to go back to do this, but if you looked at the potential value of a particular species, they really like this one, but it may flower at a time when the vegetation is low or high. There might be some trade-offs between, the value to go far from the woodland edge to go get this very valuable resource, as opposed to how much cover there would be, early versus late.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Okay. There are, like I mentioned, there are some species that deer just tend to prefer overall. And I know that there's this idea that there's this trade-off. I don't remember the hypothesis itself or what the name for it is. But if this one species is providing a very valuable resource and it's necessary, and deer just really need it or prefer it for whatever reason, they're going to be more likely to travel farther away from the edge to obtain it, which is a risk in early season because there isn't very tall vegetation to really keep them safe from either predators or from heat or from anything else. So as the growing season progresses, and of course I've said this a lot of times, plants will get taller, and then there will be more cover, so that threat decreases, and that trade-off is a lot greater for deer because they'll have this species available to them, but not necessarily still as much of a threat from predators.
Thank you.
Sure. Maris.
Hi, Jack.
Hi.
Great. First, very good job.
Thank you.
Number 2, I took notes. I know I was
Oh no.
Okay. So my question is kind of a two-part question.
Sure.
So I'm pretty sure you told us how often you were doing your observation studies. You were looking at early versus late summer. How often you were going out and observing? And the reason I'm asking is because I noticed that your early summer was only 2 months. It was June and July, whereas your late summer was 3 months, being that it was August, September, October. Right. And if you were consistently observing across both early summer and late summer, do you consider it all the fact that it maybe skewed a little bit, that you're observing more in your 3-month period versus the 2 months?
That's a very good point. Honestly, I was able to accomplish surveying a lot quicker in May to June because school doesn't start then. So I just had more time available for me to survey. I wasn't necessarily surveying at the exact same, like one day I would survey, one day I wouldn't, one day I would survey. There weren't any necessarily consistent timeframes between them. But since plants are still pretty much available and growing even well into October, I don't think it skews it because I had, for the most part, the same amount of time that I surveyed within each of these sites. If that makes sense.
Yes.
Okay. That was both parts? Oh, sweet. All right, great. Dr. Lori.
So I have a stats question.
Of course.
Save it for when it's just the four of us.
Thank you. Yeah.
So the question that kind of relates to maybe what Greg was also mentioning is like the corollary relation to just where the resources are.
Yeah.
Like early in the season, before everything starts, shooting up above ground on the prairie, they're in the riparian area. What are they eating, and what sort of like resource availability of like what's in the riparian area versus what's out in the field? Because if there's nothing in the field for them to eat, there's not really much of a reason to go on.
Right. Yeah, and that's why I mentioned that I think something really interesting would be these spatial correlations of what's available. I didn't really look at them within sites. I wasn't necessarily looking how far away they were. I have the data obviously collected at which distances they were from, but I think it would be interesting to see what was available when and where specifically, and to see if that kind of plays into the seasonality, because as you mentioned, these plants that they like to consume are just not present within the edge. They might have to go further away for them.
What's actually like inside, say, like the forest, right? So there's the one part of the edge that you can measure everything in, but you didn't really flex up in the forest.
Right. Yeah, I didn't really look at the understory there. I imagine that there are some forms present, and they could be consuming those. The closest I got to was where the egg grassland and the wooded edges met. But I don't know that there's enough understory in a lot of these places that I was surveying for them to really consume a lot of the species there. I really do think that they're just, one, they like inhabiting these woody areas, but I think it's mostly for protection. And then they were using these grasslands for nutrition, as a nutrition source. But I'm sure that there were some forms available. I just didn't necessarily look to see what was available. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. All right. Great. Let's make sure I answer your question. Abby. Okay.
I have similar. I was thinking about, you talked about the quality of habitat in grasslands, but not necessarily looking at the quality of the woodlands.
Right.
Do you think, depending on like the successionary stage of like the woodlands, or the quality of the habitats in the woodlands, do you think that would influence herbivory in grasslands? So like if you had a high quality woodland, would you then see more herbivory in a forest? Because
right.
Like, hang out in
right. That's a really good question. I think depending on the succession stage that the wooded area is in, it's going to really depend how much they're browsing, because deer do have a browse line. They have a maximum height to which they browse a lot of these woody species. If there's anything taller than that and that's all been consumed, then there's really nothing for them to eat in these woody areas. So they're definitely going to travel into grasslands. But if there's enough younger vegetation that they can easily reach it, or it's, they can just kind of like look over and it's there and they'll eat it, I'm sure that would definitely affect how much they go into grasslands, because if the resources available in the wooded edges, then yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Dr. Loring. Okay, Jake.
I may have a follow-up. At these sites, do they have any type of disturbance regime, or are they?
That's a good question. Most of them don't really have consistent disturbance regimes. For example, the landowners that I visited, they said that they left their prairies intact. They never burned them. They never really did anything to them. But there were some that I used that were on public land. Some of the KDWPT folks that I mentioned that I talked to, they did say that like 2 of my sites were regularly burned on a 3-year rotational period. I lost one of my sites at Cheney because they converted to agriculture. So they're doing something different there. But I don't really know management on most of the other ones, if I'm being honest, or in terms of how often they might be burned or not. Yeah.
Follow up on that. Do you think implementing like fires at these sites would help reduce the exposure?
Yes.
Reduce the deer recovery, or do you think they would then result in even more like early successional species?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it was the Nisi paper that I mentioned. They actually looked to see which plants deer were consuming post-burn, so immediately after burn, the ones that were emerging. As you might know, a lot of those newly emerged plants from a fire are very nutritious. They're very easy to eat, so deer will consume those. And I think actually Lespedeza capitata, one that I talked about that they didn't really like to consume, they were preferentially consuming it post-burn because of it was available, it was easy to eat. So yes, I think if they implemented burning regimes, they would get better quality prairies, they would lower the amount of woody vegetation, hopefully, and could potentially eventually reduce the amount of deer because, as I mentioned in Kanza, they did a study and there was almost no deer browsing in these very pristine prairies. Yeah. Dr. Loring.
So this is a fun question. So let's say, not you, but let's say Leland had unlimited resources for a follow-up question, and he could do some sort of manipulation of, say, resources or predation risk for the deer. How would he set something like that? Or how would Leland set
how would Leland hypothetically, with an infinite amount of resources, set up this experiment? I think it's always very popular and I mean very, very useful to use exclosures. I think part of that would be to build exclosures. One, because you could ask other people to do it so you don't have to do it. So building these exclosures at different distances from the edge, saying herbivory. And then one thing that would be really interesting, I didn't really mention, is that a lot of my sites had very similar deer densities within the area. So it would be great to acquire plots in other areas or sites in other areas that had different deer densities to see the intensity between a lot of deer, a little bit of deer relatively within these areas. And then most of the sites I had, there wasn't any hunting allowed except for like one or two of them. So I think if we also implemented maybe more a private landowner kind of thing where hunting was allowed, if deer are more skitterish or less likely to go farther away from the edge because they know that there's that threat, basically. Yeah, I think. Helicopter, yeah. Yeah. Actually, with unlimited resources and funding, I would bring back mountain lions. That's what I would do.
I think maybe that's my place.
Okay. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. I'll see you later.
You mentioned the committee that will meet by Zoom.